good evening, everyone. We might make a start now, and for those who are still coming and just trickling through the doors, we'll allow them to come and sit down. But this way is a bit fairer for the people that were here on time, and then we get to reward you with the debate here. So this is a formal welcome. You might find this in your handout, but it's so well written, I might as well just read it out in its form. The City Bible Forum and the Melbourne Uni Secular Society are committed to answering the bigger questions. We aim to stimulate thoughtful, intelligent and respectful discussion of the big questions of life between different points of view. So just in case you were looking for a bloodbath, that's not what tonight's going to be about. That's not how we run debates. We're committed to respectful and thoughtful and rigorous discussion. So now, without further ado, I'll introduce you to our two debaters for tonight. But before I do, this debate is about Jesus' resurrection and whether or not it best explains the historical facts. So we have two different points of view. We've got for the affirmative, Rhbs Martin. Now Rhbs Martin is to my left here. He's the regular host of Logos Live, and he directs the work of City Bible Forum here in Melbourne. He regularly speaks and blogs about Christian and societal matters and atheism at the Atheist Forum. And you'll find the website in your handout, atheistforum.wordpress.com. And over here to my right we have James Fodor, and he's going to be the negative for tonight. He's the president of Melbourne Uni Secular Society. He regularly engages issues relating to Christianity, belief in atheism. And he also has his own blog called The Godless Theist, and you'll also find that in your handout. So if you'll please join with me in welcoming our two speakers for tonight. Now, as an outline for tonight, we have 14 minutes for each person to give their opening remarks. And then we have 8 minutes to hear a response from both sides. Now, after the initial, 25 or so minutes, we have just under an hour of moderated discussion. And that's a chance for you guys to respond. Now, if obviously we feel like we're wrapping up, then we'll cancel it there. We won't necessarily go for a whole hour, just in case no one has any questions. But I don't think that's going to be the case. This is a fairly interesting topic, so I look forward to that discussion. About timekeeping, we'll hear a 3-minute warning, and both speakers will hear the sound. And at the 60 seconds, you'll hear a double tap. Now, if anyone goes over time, we have an innovative technology here. This is a rubber chicken. If you do go over time, you'll hear the sound, and at that point, your entire point will just be rendered obsolete because no one wants to continue over that. So that's any incentive as any to stop and stick to the 14 minutes. And as a final word before we begin. As I said before, this is a respectful debate. Speakers are interested in understanding the other's position, and so should we. So I put it to the audience during our question and answer time. Well, we should aim to respond in the same spirit as our two speakers here. If I hear questions that aren't questions, more of angry internet diatribes, I'll probably shut it down. But I don't, and I'll get the chicken. Yeah. But I don't expect that's going to come from what seems to be such a lovely audience. Okay. Without further ado, join me in welcoming Rhbs Martin as he opened the debate for his 14 minutes.
Well, good evening, everyone, and tonight's debate may clearly demonstrate me as a fool. Now, to some of you, this question is already beyond doubt, but as I stand up here advocating that Jesus was raised from the dead and he really wasn't, then I am a fool. The Apostle Paul agrees. He says, if there is no resurrection of the dead, then not even Christ has been raised, and if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. We are, of all people, most to be pitied. Now, to many in our world, the events of the first Easter, Jesus' death and supposed resurrection, are meaningless and irrelevant. Easter is just a couple of days off work. Yet Easter is supposedly based on historical events. And whilst the resurrection of Jesus is an irrelevance to many, this is the most important question that we can ever answer. And as my opponent tonight, whom I have a great deal of respect and admiration for, once wrote, he says, "This question is too important for us to simply ignore or to be satisfied with mediocre arguments on either side." And James is right. It is too important to be satisfied with mediocrity. It's worth investigating intelligently, thoughtfully, and thoroughly. Because if it's true, it becomes the world's most dangerous idea. More than just the satisfaction of knowing that our public holidays aren't based on myth, the resurrection means that the world changes. As journalist Peter Hitchens asserted, he says, "It turns the universe from a meaningless chaos into a designed place in which there is justice and there is hope. Hope for life beyond death and hope for justice in the end. And it also alters us and our responsibilities, which is why it's so dangerous." But if it didn't happen, if Jesus wasn't raised from death, then the Christian message is really quite plainly false, and I would be an irrelevant fool. If Christ were not raised, then I'd advocate closing all the churches. I'd leave my job at City Bible Forum. And perhaps more controversially, I'd say that we should remove the public holidays on Good Friday and Easter Monday. But perhaps more popularly, I'd advocate that we have more sport-based public holidays instead. But sadly, it would also mean that there is no hope for life after death. The world reverts to meaningless chaos. Christianity is an historical religion which does not advocate blind faith. It's based on historical facts which can be tested and weighed. And that's what we're doing tonight, testing and weighing the historical facts surrounding Jesus' resurrection. And contrary to the view of some hyper-skeptics, to which I'm grateful that James is not one, there are historical facts surrounding Jesus and his supposed resurrection which require explanation. Facts that require explanation even if you reject God and the resurrection hypothesis. So that's the purpose of tonight's debate. It's abductive inference to the best explanation. What best explains the facts surrounding Jesus' resurrection? Now, our perspective on this issue will be influenced by our presuppositions. If we suppose or we assume that miracles are impossible and that God doesn't exist, then it's unlikely that you're going to be convinced that a miracle like the resurrection happened. Now, if this is you, then you're not going to be persuaded by anything I say tonight, simply because you assume a closed, atheistic universe. I chatted with an atheist once last year and I asked him, what would convince you that God was there? And he replied, a miracle. I then asked him, do you believe that miracles can happen? And he said, no. I thought, well, what's the point of talking about this anymore? There's nothing that I could have said that would have persuaded him that a miracle occurred, which means that I could never have produced any evidence for God that would satisfy him. His assumptions skewed any evidence presented away from any supernatural conclusion. Now, this presupposition becomes crucial when assessing the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Because if we believe in the existence of God or a supernatural agent, one who can raise dead people to life, if we believe this is improbable or controversial, then we'll always prefer a naturalistic solution, even if this solution doesn't really explain all the facts. Sorry, can I just pause there for 1 second just to change the microphone? Just because that's, is that okay? Sorry. Test. Oh, that's actually better. Sorry about that. Sorry. So if we need to, this solution doesn't really explain all of that, so I hope that microphone's not going to be too bad, sorry. So we must be careful, if it's possible at all, to not let our presuppositions cloud our judgment on what constitutes or best explains the historical data. We must provide a hypothesis which explains all the facts without resorting to just so stories or implausible reconstructions. So what are the historical facts? I'll outline 4. On the Sunday following Jesus' crucifixion, Jesus' tomb was found empty by women. Now, the fact that all 4 Gospels report women as the first witnesses of the empty tomb requires explanation, as it's unlikely to have been invented. Now, it might come as a bit of a shock to our modern ears, but in the ancient world, the testimony of a woman was not viewed as credible as a man's. In the Greco-Roman world, educated men regarded women as gullible in religious matters and especially prone to superstitious fantasy and excessive in religious practices. For example, ancient Jewish historian Josephus said, "From women let no evidence be accepted because of the levity and the temerity of their sex." 2nd century opponent of Christianity, Celsus, criticised the reliability of the resurrection stories for precisely this reason. He denounces the resurrection based on Jesus appearing to Mary, asking, who did Jesus appear to? A half-frantic woman. If you wanted to invent a resurrection and give it credibility, you wouldn't put women as the first witnesses. You'd have a male witness. Yet the stories have all been preserved with women as the first witnesses of the empty tomb, most plausibly because that's what actually happened. Furthermore, the earliest alternative explanation offered for the resurrection, recorded in Matthew 28, suggests that the disciples stole the body, which interestingly presumes an empty tomb. There is no evidence that the body was forgotten, changed or stolen. The empty tomb and the reports of its discovery by women requires explanation. Fact number 2 is that multiple people on multiple occasions were convinced that they had seen Jesus alive. The most important piece of evidence surrounding the resurrection of Jesus is a Christian creed, or a summary of belief that the Apostle Paul quotes in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And this is the earliest witness to the resurrection. It describes Jesus' death, assumes a burial in a tomb, and contains explicit reference to his resurrection and appearing to 6 people or groups of people. Now this creed is incredibly early, and even skeptical scholars date it to no later than 3 years after Jesus' crucifixion, leaving almost no time for legendary embellishment. This creed contains different types of resurrection appearances. Multiple people, single people, people on the inner circle, people on the outer circle, close friends of Jesus, and vociferous opponents. Now, some of these appearances are corroborated in the Gospel accounts. For example, the appearance of Paul and the appearance of Peter, and possibly the appearance of the Apostles 12 and even the 500. But furthermore, if we overlay the data from 1 Corinthians with the resurrection appearances in later sources, such as the Gospel and Acts, further types of resurrection appearances emerge. Luke Acts record Jesus' appearance to Paul as a bright light outside with sound. Yet within the same narrative, another occurrence is where Jesus appears to his disciples inside, where Jesus eats food to demonstrate him as a physical person. Moreover, the documents record the disciples' clear scepticism towards the resurrection. They require convincing that it was true. The disciples dismiss the women's testimony as an idle tale. Thomas won't believe until he touches Jesus. And Jesus demonstrates to his disciples he's not a ghost by eating fish. The clearest examples of scepticism are the conversion of opponents, Paul and James. What explains their radical conversion to a faith that certainly Paul actively persecuted? Paul's conversion can be tantamount to Richard Dawkins being converted and starting his own apologetics ministry. These multiple appearances in multiple forms to multiple types of people require explanation. Third, the lives of the first disciples were changed in a manner consistent with such a dramatic event. Events have consequences, and these consequences need to be explained. Even if a resurrection didn't happen, we need to explain the sudden transformation of the early disciples of Jesus. Some kind of powerful, transformative experience is required to explain while this group of disciples left their previous vocations to preach the message of resurrection amidst opposition and persecution, where many died for their beliefs. Now, these deaths don't demonstrate the truth of the message. Many people die for foolish causes, but generally people don't die for something that they know is false. There was no personal advantage for these disciples to preach the resurrection. We need to explain why they willingly became fools and died. And fourth, the emergence of documents over a short period of time in the first century written by Jews which contained controversial reference to the resurrection of Jesus. Now, some skeptics want to say that the Bible provides no evidence of a resurrection because it's a biased religious book. But historically speaking, this is no explanation. What requires explanation is the emergence of these documents. In history, why did suddenly a series of documents appear in a very short period of time which outline and describe this resurrection of a man, Jesus, from the dead? We may deny the resurrection, but we still need to explain the emergence of these documents. Who wrote them and for what purpose? What motivated them to write about the resurrection of a man who was never actually resurrected? The descriptions of Jesus and his resurrection in these documents were very different from prevailing expectations. First, Jesus was described as a Messiah. Yet no Jew was expecting a Messiah to suffer and die, let alone to be raised to life. Jews were expecting their Messiah to defeat the pagans, not to die at their hands. Failed messianic movements were not new in Judaism, and these movements died out with their leaders. But Jesus, called Messiah, was different. Moreover, Jesus' resurrection, as described in these documents, was also different to expectations. The predominant view amongst first century Jews was that the resurrection would be part of the end of the world, the final judgment in which everyone would be raised. The resurrection of an individual in the middle of history was not anticipated and was without Jewish parallel. Jesus' life, death and resurrection is fundamentally different to Jewish messianic expectations. Now, how this emerged requires clear explanation. Furthermore, the genre of the New Testament documents require explanation. The early church wrote 4 Gospels in the genre of Greco-Roman biography. The fact that the 4 evangelists chose to adopt a Greco-Roman biographical conventions to tell the story of Jesus indicated that they were concerned to communicate what they thought actually happened. Why did the early church write biographies of Jesus, which included resurrection accounts? And why do we have 4, emerging within 20 to 30 years of each other? Most ancient biographies were of famous generals, kings or philosophers. Why 4 biographies of a penniless preacher who contained a controversial understanding of resurrection? The emergence of documents written by Jews containing controversial elements requires explanation. So what best explains all of these? The empty tomb found by women, multiple resurrection appearances, the changed lives of the disciples, and the emergence of documents with controversial resurrection references? Well, these 4 facts must all be explained satisfactorily without resorting to just-so stories, positing solutions without evidence, or overlooking facts. Rejecting any of these facts must require evidence and reasons, otherwise it's simply appealing to prejudice and presupposition. No naturalistic explanation can simultaneously account for the empty tomb and the variety of resurrection appearances. Skeptics consistently fail to provide plausible alternative explanations to explain why the church suddenly and with such enthusiasm believed in Jesus' resurrection. Instead, the resurrection of Jesus best explains these facts. As scholar N.T. Wright says, the early Christians did not invent the empty tomb and the meetings or sightings of the risen Jesus in order to explain a faith they already had. They developed that faith because of the occurrence and convergence of these 2 phenomena. No one was expecting this kind of thing. No kind of conversion experience would have generated such ideas. Nobody would have invented it, no matter how guilty or how forgiven that they felt. No matter how many hours they poured over the scriptures, to suggest otherwise is to stop doing history and enter into a fantasy world of our own, a new kind of cognitive dissonance in which the relentless modernist, desperately worried that the post-enlightenment worldview seems in imminent danger of collapse, devises strategies for shoring it up nevertheless. So what best explains these historical facts? Early Jewish people believed that Jesus was physically raised from the dead by God, and they willingly became fools for that belief.
Alright, we'll now have 40 minutes for James's opening discussion, so please join with me in welcoming him to the podium.
Thanks, Stephen. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm very grateful for this opportunity to discuss this very important topic with Robert here. Now, I'm just curious, could I see a quick raise of hands? How many people here believe that Jesus raised from the dead, was resurrected from the dead? How many people believe that he wasn't, or probably wasn't? Alright, so that's interesting. I've got my task set out for me. Luckily, however, my goal this evening is not to convince any of you who believe that Jesus rose from the dead that he didn't. That's not my goal. My goal is to argue that there is a plausible naturalistic explanation for the historical facts. You may have other reasons for believing that Jesus rose from the dead, experiential reasons, theological reasons, or whatever else. I'm not attempting to address those this evening. I'm only interested in the question, can we explain the historical facts naturalistically, that is, without reference to God or other such devices? And I think we can. And in fact, I think the best explanation for the facts is a naturalistic one. So that's my goal this evening, to outline and defend that thesis. So I agree with the majority of what Robert has said, actually, in his opening remarks, specifically regarding the historical facts. In brief, I acknowledge the empty tomb, the appearances, the disciples' belief in the resurrection, and the origin of the canonical Gospels with the resurrection appearance references in them. Now, many atheists in addressing this question will deny one or more of these historical facts, and I think that this is an unsatisfactory approach. The only one of these four facts that's really contested by scholars is the empty tomb, and even that is supported by many skeptical scholars. Even if you don't think these facts are like completely confirmed, I think they're at least quite plausible, and it's therefore incumbent upon an atheist like me to be able to provide a reasonable explanation as to how they could come about, if in fact the solution is not a supernatural intervention. Nor do I think, and I agree with Robert here, that it's satisfactory to just argue that, again, as many atheists do, miracles are impossible, or by definition they're always the worst explanation. I think that's really question-begging, and one needs to be able to provide a rigorous account, if one thinks that the explanation is not supernatural, of how these facts could have come to be, without presupposing that miracles can't occur. So my case this evening doesn't depend on any assumptions about whether miracles can or cannot occur. Okay, so that's my task this evening, to outline a plausible naturalistic explanation for these facts. But before I do that, I need to outline a bit about what I mean by an explanation. Well, what is an explanation, and how do we judge good from bad or better from worse explanations? So the concept of explanation is actually a bit complicated philosophically speaking, but in general, it's the general account that philosophers give is that an explanation consists of a set of statements or propositions which, when taken together, entail the facts to be explained. Now, by entail, this doesn't mean that the facts have to follow from the explanation with a sort of deductive certainty, like you could work it out mathematically or anything, but they should follow from the explanation with a reasonably good probability, or reasonable plausibility. Philosopher Charles Peirce has described it this way, and I think that this is a good way of thinking about it. Given an explanation, the facts to be explained by that explanation should follow as a matter of course, and that's sort of the way I tend to think about it. So, explanations are judged in accordance with three main criteria that were of relevance to us this evening: explanatory scope, explanatory power, and plausibility. Explanatory scope refers to the number or range of facts that can be accounted for by the explanation. So generally, the more facts it can account for, the better an explanation it is. Explanatory power refers to how likely the facts are rendered by the explanation. So some explanations will render their facts only slightly more likely than without the explanation, whereas some explanations will render the facts very considerably more likely. And the more likely the facts in question can be rendered by the explanation, then the more explanatory power that explanation has with respect to those facts. Thirdly, plausibility. So the plausibility of an explanation refers to how likely or probable any assumptions that we need to make for the explanation to go ahead are, given our background evidence and previously established knowledge. So pretty much all explanations require some assumptions that we aren't sort of certain about beforehand, and the more plausible these are, then the better the explanation is. So these are the three criteria that I'm going to be using to assess explanations in the debate this evening. So that leads me to my proposed explanation for the historical facts, which I'm calling the Rhbs Model. This stands for Reburial, Hallucinations, the acronym stands for Reburial, Hallucinations, Biases, and Socialization. And each of those key elements of the model I'll now outline in turn. So first of all, reburial. So under one plausible scenario, I think Jesus' burial in Joseph's tomb, Joseph of Arimathea, was always intended to be temporary. This decision was made as a result of the fast approaching Sabbath, the nearness of Joseph's tomb, and also a desire to avoid a further disruptive public spectacle that occurred with Jesus' trial and his death. Now, I think this temporary burial hypothesis is quite plausible in the light of a number of facts. First of all, we know that Jewish law required that bodies be taken down from crucifixion or from other public execution sites before the evening came. We read about this in Deuteronomy. It's also mentioned in John. Second of all, we know that the Gospels indicate that the burial was rushed. So, for example, in Mark 15:42, it's reported that Joseph of Arimathea only asked for Jesus' body when evening had already come, because it was the preparation day, that is, the day before the Sabbath. So if evening had already come, that means that the Sabbath is just about to begin. The Sabbath began at sundown, which meant that there was very little time for the body to be buried. Also, in John 19:42, we similarly read that, therefore, because of the Jewish day of preparation, since the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus there. So again, the indication here is that there's not much time for the burial to take place, and Joseph's tomb was selected, at least in part, because it was nearby. The third thing that we know is that in Jewish custom, criminals are buried in a different location separate from ordinary Jews, likely to be some distance away. So the communal burial site that likely would have been the final resting place for Jesus would likely have been some distance away. And fourthly, we also know that the Jewish and Roman authorities were concerned about keeping public order, and they would not have wanted another public spectacle and possible riot or other disorder associated with a public spectacle around Jesus' burial. So that would explain why they would be particularly concerned to arrest Jesus' body in a private space, and then at the earliest convenience, which was after the end of the Sabbath, so on Saturday evening, Jesus' body was removed and buried permanently in a place for convicted criminals. So that's the reburial aspect of the hypothesis. Now, the next element of the explanation are individual hallucinations. So following the discovery of the empty tomb by the women on Sunday morning, exacerbated by grief and emotional excitement and all of the factors surrounding the events, one or more of Jesus' women followers who found the tomb experienced individual hallucinations of the risen Jesus. So there's a few facts that we know from psychology which I think are relevant to making these individual hallucinations plausible. First of all, we know that hallucinations are very common. There's a tendency to think that hallucinations are something that the mentally ill experience, but this isn't true. So one study, for example, found that in a review, between 10 and 37% of people reported experiencing auditory hallucinations. Another thing we know from the psychological literature is that a particularly common type of hallucination are called bereavement hallucinations following the death of a loved one or a close one. So again, in another study, half of the subjects felt the presence of a deceased person, and 1/3 of them reported seeing, hearing, or talking to the deceased. And thirdly, it's also well known that hallucinations are especially common in religious and highly emotive contexts, which of course are relevant in the case of the women. So I think taken together, it's quite plausible that the women, upon discovering the empty tomb, may have experienced individual hallucinations of Jesus appearing to them. The third element of the model are group religious experiences. So after the women followers found the empty tomb, had hallucinations, they then went to the male disciples and discussed their experiences with them, told them what happened. This generated an expectation that the male disciples might experience something similar. So partly as a result of this expectation, also mediated by social reinforcement, strong emotions, and all of the other factors surrounding the events, the early disciples had a number of collective religious experiences of the risen Jesus, and this accounts for the appearances that we have reported. So, this is psychologically known behaviour. So, psychologist Donovan Rawcliffe, who's studied these sorts of events, wrote, quote, "The same factors which operate for a single individual in the induction of hallucinations may become even more effective in an excited or expectant crowd, and on occasion may result in mass hallucinations. This is not to say that any two people are capable of having precisely the same hallucination in every respect identical, but similar preconceptions and expectations can undoubtedly result in hallucinatory visions so alike that subsequent comparisons would not disclose any discrepancy. Dissimilar hallucinatory experiences often attain a spurious similarity by a process of harmonization in subsequent recollection and conversation." End quote. So, not just psychologically, but I think also historically we have good grounds for thinking that these sorts of things can occur. We have numerous cases historically of people reporting to experience highly unusual events that almost certainly didn't happen. So just a few examples. The Westfall UFO encounter of 1966, which I think actually happened in Melbourne. A flying saucer was seen over a school by a group of several hundred people. Many marine apparitions of the Virgin Mary appearing to thousands of people at once, for example, Our Lady's Eye Tomb in Cairo. Reports of the angels appearing over the trenches in the First World War and the Angels of Mons incident. And mass hysteria like the genital shrinking epidemics that have happened in a number of African countries where people come to believe that their genitals are shrinking when they're not. So I think it's actually plausible that these sort of group collective appearances could have occurred. Fourth element of the model, memory of cognitive biases. So in the process of discussing their experiences between themselves, the disciples' memories of what they had experienced were reshaped through processes of reconstructive recall, social memory contagion, and other biases that increased the coherence and impressiveness of these accounts. So once again, I think that there's ample psychological literature to indicate the plausibility of these processes. Psychologist Elizabeth Loftus has studied the formation of false memories, and in a TED Talk about this, she gives this fascinating case of Steve Titus, who was falsely accused of rape, and the victim at the trial stated that she was absolutely positive that he was the man who did it. But in fact, the real culprit later confessed, and it was determined that the victim's memory had been falsely manipulated by repeated exposure to Titus and also by the suggestion of the police officers. So this sort of thing we know can happen, where people's memories can be dramatically changed. other experimental studies validate this. So in one study found that 76% of participants came to remember seeing non-existent film footage of the sinking of a passenger liner. In a different study, 40% of participants recalled seeing non-existent footage of an explosion in a Bali nightclub. Yet further studies have also found that people will incorporate misinformation from others into their own memories of the event, even if you warn them that this might happen. So taken together again, I think it's quite plausible from the psychological literature that these memory and cognitive biases do occur and will reshape the way we remember things. The final, fifth element of the model, socialization and marginalization of doubt. This operates by a process of public expressions of doubt and skepticism, any disagreement are marginalized by processes of socialization and conformity, and also tendency to sort of believe no matter what the evidence is. And I think we have comparable historical cases of this. The Jehovah's Witnesses have made a number of specific prophecies about Jesus coming again or the world ending or something like that, which on many occasions have been falsified. And yet the movement continues and still thrives to this day, illustrating the ability of people to justify their beliefs despite apparent, obvious disconfirmation. So taken together, I think the Rhbs model, as I've outlined it, only in brief, has the explanatory scope and power to account for the historical facts. And given the psychological, sociological and historical evidence, only some of which I've been able to cite in limited time, I think that it's quite plausible. Now, very briefly, in the limited time I have left, I just want to compare the resurrection hypothesis with the Rhbs model as I've outlined it. The resurrection hypothesis is typically stated as something like God raised Jesus from the dead. Now, I think that as stated in this way, it clearly lacks the explanatory scope and power necessary to account for all other facts. It does account for the empty tomb. Obviously, Jesus is resurrected, his body's not there anymore. But it doesn't account for the appearances. Now, perhaps if you or I came back from the dead, we just naturally go, and obviously we want to tell all our friends about it and show, hey, how awesome is this? I'm back from the dead. But we're talking about God raising Jesus back from the dead. We can't just impute our own psychological tendencies to him and presume that, well, because he was resurrected, it just must be the case that he would appear to people. I think an additional assumption is necessary here that Jesus had a reason or desire to appear to his disciples, perhaps to validate his divine mission, which doesn't just immediately follow from the hypothesis God raised Jesus from the dead. Remember that Jesus could have appeared even if he wasn't resurrected. Some early Gnostics believed this. Jesus could have also been resurrected without appearing to anyone, as the oldest copies of the Gospel of Mark indicate, which don't include any of the appearances. Jesus also might have appeared to anyone, really, like the people in the ancient Americas, as Mormons believe. So I think it's clear that we need an additional assumption here that Jesus had some reason or desire to appear to his disciples. In addition to the two other assumptions that the resurrection hypothesis needs, namely that God exists and that God has some reason to raise Jesus from the dead. So these three assumptions here are necessary for the resurrection hypothesis to go through. But how plausible are they? I think it's very difficult to say. They're not among the widely accepted background beliefs that can be established that we would generally agree on. Of course, if you already believe that Jesus was the Son of God, then you're going to think these hypotheses are plausible. But if you don't believe that, then how can you adjudicate how plausible they are? I think that's the fundamental problem with the resurrection hypothesis. It relies on knowledge of God's intentions and desires, and that's something we don't have access to absent specific theological presuppositions. If you don't adopt those presuppositions, which I don't as a non-Christian, then I don't think the resurrection hypothesis is the most plausible explanation. By contrast, I think the Rhbs model, as I've outlined it, relies only on assumptions which can be demonstrated as plausible given accepted knowledge from history, psychology, and sociology and similar disciplines. And as a result, it is the superior explanation for the historical facts. Thank you very much.
I'm sure you're all thinking through those both models right now. After about half an hour of our opening remarks, we're going to move into our rebuttals now. So I'm going to give 8 minutes to each side, starting with Robert Martin. So here he comes.
So we're having a debate tonight. James seems to be agreeing with a lot of what I'm talking about, which is great, because I think to James's credit, there are facts which need to be discussed and explained. As James's credit, he's admitted that there are facts, particularly the empty tomb and the resurrected appearances, etc. And also James has raised a very important point about the plausibility of miracles, and that some people will deny suggest that it's question begging to deny miracles because of that. James has rightly asked that tonight's debate is really about plausibility. What is more plausible? how we explain these facts. The facts that I outlined was the empty tomb was found by women, the multiple resurrection appearances, the changed lives of the disciples, and the emergence of documents, more than just the canonical Gospels, but just all the emergence of documents with controversial resurrection appearances, resurrection references. And as James has rightly pointed out, that the explanation followed as a matter of course based on scope, power, and plausibility. Unfortunately, though, at this point, that's where I begin to diverge from James's agreement, because I would argue that the Rhbs model, and please forgive me if I inadvertently call it the Royal Bank of Scotland model, the RBS model, so please forgive me if I do that, but the Rhbs model, I think, fails at a number of levels, particularly the plausibility and the believability, which leads us on to the main issue, which I think is actually related to the presuppositions that we bring into it. The issue of the empty tomb, and it's wonderful to hear that James actually acknowledges that there was an empty tomb, which does require explanation. However, unfortunately, his reconstruction or suggestion is somewhat, I think, utterly implausible. The fact, I might controversially agree that I think that Jesus' burial possibly, or most likely, was possibly temporary, but that, unfortunately, James presents no evidence for a reburial, which I think is a crucial thing to have. All the evidence we have suggests that the reburial, as James has outlined, is actually the most unlikely event. It's certainly convenient, but it doesn't actually explain the fact. Certainly, as James has outlined, there was a practice within Judaism for secondary burial, or a reburial, after it had been, a body had been interred for a period of time, it would be reburied. But this was usually, well, the usual Jewish burial practices required a 7-day period of mourning. Then it was customary after a year to gather the bones, because the body would be dedicated, and then to move it into an ossuary. And so in this case, it would be implausible that they would move the body at such an early stage. It was going to be moved perhaps at some point, but certainly not immediately. And there was no indication that they were going to move it so fast. But the big problem comes is that there's no reason to suggest why would a leading Jew defile himself by carrying a body on the Sabbath, particularly a holy Sabbath such as the Passover. It's utterly implausible to suggest that they were going to move the body that day, particularly during a period of mourning, which was a 7-day period. Why would they want to move the body? Particularly, as I said, it was on a Sabbath day, which was particularly holy. Joseph of Arimathea was a leading Jew who wouldn't want to do that. Not to also defies belief that also one of the most important Jewish holidays, a leading member of the council would stagger around carrying a dead body with 30 kilos of spices as well. So the reason that the women came to put spices on the tomb on the Sunday morning, because that was the first opportunity that they had. And so it seems utterly implausible that they would have actually moved the body and not told anyone, because again, you've got this 7-day period of mourning in which the people who were, the Jews who were keen to honour their dead leader wanted to give him a proper burial. So the fact that the body was moved, it defies any sense of proper explanation for Jewish burial practices and for Jewish understanding of burial, but not only also the most plausible explanation is that the women came to the tomb on the first day to insert or to put spices on the body, and the body was missing. And again, James hasn't actually accounted for the women's testimony of the empty tomb as well. But when we come to the issue of hallucinations and of modern psychology, and it's true, people do have hallucinations of people who have died, etc. But the key question we need to ask is, what likelihood or what plausibility is there for first-century Jews who believed in resurrection at the end of time would be convinced that the hallucination they had, if they had a hallucination, could be construed as resurrection? Because at best, I think that they would suggest that the hallucination would suggest that they would think that this Jesus character has come to me from the end, telling me that his soul is safe and that I am going to look forward to him being reunited with him at the resurrection on the last day. That would be a more plausible reconstruction if hallucinations was the dominant paradigm here. Because the Jews would never have anticipated that a hallucination would indicate, oh, he's actually raised from the dead. That's just unlikely to have occurred because of precisely of the reason that they weren't going to expect it. Similarly, they weren't expecting that the Messiah would not only would die, but that they would also be... they weren't expecting their Messiah to die, and they weren't expecting the type of resurrection that came. And similarly, we also need to account, as I said before in my opening statement, we need to account for the different types of resurrection appearances. Some of them, like for example, the appearance to Paul, maybe it could be suggested it was a hallucination. You saw the risen Jesus, it was a bright light, who knows what happens there, he saw Jesus. But this doesn't explain the different types of resurrection appearances that we have, people touching Jesus, people talking to him, and the skepticism that was developed within the early Jewish community. The Apostle Thomas, for example, said, I'm not going to believe until I see him and touch him. And so this becomes very difficult to account for with the hallucinations. And similarly with the idea of the early community had biases and were intent on trying to suppress or marginalise different opinions, it flies in the face of the facts. As I outlined before, there was clear scepticism within the narratives which have been reported, which requires explanation. That the women, the first women who came, they were told this is nothing but an idle tale. That's Thomas, and then Luke records that they were presenting many convincing proofs that Jesus was alive, recognising that there was clear scepticism within the early community. And so we need to account for the different types of resurrection appearances. And unfortunately, the Rhbs model doesn't do that, because it seems to be based on some sort of almost peer pressure suggestion that we're going to kind of force a certain type of resurrection appearance, but the evidence just doesn't do that. We've got a number of probably 9 or 10 different types of resurrection appearances which require explanation. And I'm certainly going to concede, yes, that there are elements of memory and cognitive bias which is a valid and a legitimate psychological phenomenon. But the question we've got to ask is, how valid is that applying to first century Jews, considering that they wanted that someone is raised from the dead? Certainly we can have experiences about UFOs, usually which is an external appearance that we interpret in some sort of way. But why are we going to interpret internal events in our minds as an hallucination to suddenly be recorded in documents within a lifetime of, less than a lifetime of the people, to say that this is actually a resurrection of someone who I can taste and touch? The big issue that James has raised is actually the issue of presuppositions. That if we presume that a resurrection is more likely because of an existing faith that we have, then it's going to skew our final assessment. And so if we believe that God is more likely, therefore resurrection is more likely, then also we could also ask the converse and say, well, if God is unlikely, then resurrection is going to be unlikely. And unfortunately, it will be our presuppositions that will determine the evidence, not the evidence explaining the facts. And the best explanation of the facts is that Jesus really did raise from the dead. I think that's 8 minutes. Thank you.
That was 8 minutes and 10 seconds. I'm not going to use the rubber chicken.
I was finishing up.
All right, and now we're just going to go to James for his remarks. So 8 minutes again, James, and make him feel welcome.
Thanks, Rob, and thank you everyone again. So, Rob and I agree that the task this evening is to provide the most reasonable explanation for the historical facts. And we're largely in agreement about what those facts are. Where we differ is in what the best explanation is. So I've outlined my Rhbs model, and I think I've defended for why it is reasonable and has the explanatory scope and power necessary. I want to respond to some of the criticisms that Robert has made of the account. And broadly these fit into 2 categories: criticisms of my hypothesis of the reburial, explaining the empty tomb, and criticisms about the hallucinations plausibly leading to belief in the resurrection of Jesus. So let me consider the issue of the empty tomb first. So Robert stated that we have no evidence for a reburial. I would differ about that. I would argue that the fact of the empty tomb is evidence for a reburial. Think about it. If we went to any tomb or any burial of anyone else and found that the tomb was empty, that the body was not there when we know it had been placed there, what would we conclude? We'd conclude, well, it's probably likely that someone has reburied this. This is precisely the evidence that favours reburial. Think about it this way. I'm saying that reburial explains the fact of the empty tomb. Robert is saying that a resurrection explains the fact of the empty tomb. I think they both explain the fact, but we don't have direct evidence for either of them. I don't have a direct document saying that Joseph moved the body. We don't have direct evidence, like video footage or whatever, or even reports of the resurrection event itself. Both are hypotheses to explain the same fact. So saying that there's no evidence for it, I think, sort of misses the point. We're trying to explain the facts here using plausible explanations. Robert mentioned this Jewish practice of leaving the body for a year and then moving the bones and reburying them, and this did happen. That's not what I'm referring to when I'm talking about reburial. Indeed, reburial is perhaps not even exactly the right word, because I don't exactly think that the the placement of Jesus' body in Joseph's tomb was considered a burial. It was more of a temporary storage of the body. Robert asked why a Jew would want to do this, carrying around the body on the Sabbath. Well, first of all, I'm not arguing that Joseph of Arimathea was doing anything on the Sabbath. Remember, according to the Jewish reckoning, the Sabbath begins on sundown on Friday evening and ends on sundown on Saturday evening. And so I think that after sundown on Saturday evening, when the Sabbath was finished, was the time, that's the first time available when the body could have been moved. And that's precisely when Joseph would have moved the body. Not necessarily personally, he had servants, he was a rich man, he could afford these sorts of things. Why would he want to do that? Because a convicted criminal's body is in his family tomb. He wants to get it out of there. He wants to get it in where it should be permanently buried. And I can imagine sort of conversations he might have had with his wife or family and friends when he got home. A family tomb is an expensive thing, and it was burial practices were very important in ancient Judaism. And when Joseph of Arimathea goes home and tells his wife about how he used his family tomb to house the body of a convicted criminal and false messiah, I can just imagine her saying, "You did what with our family tomb?" Of course, Joseph wants to get the body out of the tomb as soon as possible. And Saturday evening is exactly the first opportunity he would have to do this. As for the 7-day period of mourning that Robert mentioned, that's irrelevant to the Joseph of Arimathea or the Jewish authorities who wanted to get the body out of the tomb. That may have been relevant to the disciples, but I don't think it's relevant to them. And I think I have accounted for the women's testimony of the empty tomb. I think the reason we have women's testimony of the empty tomb is most probably because women really did discover an empty tomb. Exactly the same reason that Robert thinks. The only difference is why the tomb was empty. But I think I've given plausible reasons to think that the tomb may have been empty simply by reburial and not requiring positing a resurrection. Now, let's move to the issue of hallucinations, whether these could plausibly explain the origin of beliefs in a resurrected Jesus. Robert has argued that the Jews weren't expecting a resurrection, and this is not the type of thing they would have interpreted any hallucinations that they would have had to be. In particular, they weren't expecting a Messiah to die and rise from the dead. They were expecting the resurrection to happen at the end of time, not sort of during the middle of history. But remember that, as a number of scholars like Bart Ehrman have shown, a significant amount of Jesus' teaching was that of an apocalyptic prophet. Jesus believed, and his disciples believed, that the end of the world was nigh, that the kingdom of God was at hand. So when Jesus' followers started saying, or thinking at least, that Jesus might have been resurrected, I think this is how they started to interpret their appearances, they didn't think that it was in the middle of history. They thought that this was a sign of the end times, that this was proof that the end was just about to come. And we see some corroboration of this in reports, for example, Matthew, who talks about the graves opening up and people walking around. That this seems to be a sign that they thought that the end was coming, and that Jesus' resurrection was just the very first, and that the resurrection of the rest of the righteous was just around the corner. This is language like Jesus being the first fruits of them that slept is consistent with this. They believe, Jesus was just coming first and then everyone else was about to be resurrected because the end of the world was right there. Likewise, I think that the reason that they interpreted their experiences as a resurrection was precisely because they had appearances of Jesus appearing to them, or they believed they did, and they had the empty tomb. And I think that's the same as what Robert thinks, that the reason that they believed that Jesus was resurrected because he appeared to them, or they believed he did, and because they had the empty tomb. And that's what I think as well. I just explain the appearances in the empty tomb differently. But I think the logic's essentially the same. That's why they interpreted it as a resurrection. Remember that after these events, they're going to be talking to each other, reading through their scriptures, debating, trying to work out what's going on. And the resurrection is what they came up with as in the theological context, as, well, their best explanation of what happened. Now, one point that Robert has made is that what my Rhbs model can't account for is the skepticism that the disciples exhibit with regard to the appearances. I actually think, contrary to Robert, this is evidence in favour of the Rhbs model. Let me explain. Think about if Robert's hypothesis were true, that Jesus really was God. That means, presumably, that the miracle reports of walking on water and raising the dead and healings and feeding the 5,000 and all of these other sorts of things presumably happened. If that was the case, the disciples have already witnessed Jesus perform all of these marvellous miracles, including raising the dead. Therefore, why would they be so sceptical about him coming back from the dead? I mean, even if they didn't exactly expect it, by the way, if you take the Gospel seriously, Jesus predicted that he would rise from the dead. But anyway, even aside from that, the disciples have already seen all these miracles, so why would they be so dogmatically sceptical about him appearing to them again? So I don't think the resurrection hypothesis actually explains the skepticism motifs that we see in the Gospels. What's my explanation for these motifs? My explanation is that this so-called avowal of prior skepticism is exactly what we see when psychologists and other people look at the literature about people who think they've experienced religious experiences or paranormal experiences or other things like this, seeing aliens, that sort of thing. Psychologist Anna Stone explains, the avowal of prior skepticism is a narrative device designed to enhance the credibility of the narrator and the likelihood of attribution of the event to a paranormal cause, in this case supernatural cause. The technique works like this. A typical narrative account starts with an avowal of prior skepticism. At first I'm skeptical, followed by a description of an anomalous occurrence. But a psychic told me things that you would not know, or in this case, Jesus appeared to us, which in turn is followed by a conversion. I realised that something out of the ordinary was occurring, or in this case, Jesus rose from the dead. This technique highlights the strength of the evidence that caused a change in the narrator's attitude from initial skepticism to belief. By highlighting the narrator's reliance on evidence, the account also positions the reader as a rational thinker, end quote. And this is exactly consistent with what we read in the Gospels, which repeatedly say, these accounts are written to convince you that Jesus rose from the dead. More signs than could be written here were given, more proofs and so on. I think this is exactly what we would expect, these avowals of prior skepticism, given what we know about other similar reports from the psychological literature, on the assumption that these appearances were hallucinations. So, to sum up, I think that the Rhbs model has withstood the criticisms that Robert has levied against it. Of course, there are many more that could potentially be, and hopefully we'll get to some of those in the discussion. But I just want to briefly touch on this idea of presuppositions. Presuppositions obviously matter. If you believe, for other reasons, as I said, theological experience or whatever, that Jesus was the Son of God, or something along those lines, a similar belief, then you're going to be much more likely to think that Robert's account is plausible. If you don't believe that, then you're much more likely to think that my account is plausible. So absolutely presuppositions are doing work here because they affect the plausibility that you assign to the different hypotheses. And I don't think that that's something that we can really change because, I mean, in order to address that, we have to debate, well, how plausible is it that God exists? How plausible is it that all of these specific theological claims about Jesus and the Messiahship and so on are true? And obviously we can't address all those tonight. So I'm just going to have to rest and say that if you don't accept these claims, if we bracket these out as being contested, then I think, given the claims that we all agree on, these findings from psychology and sociology and historical parallels and so on those alone, the Rhbs model, the naturalistic explanation, is the best one of the historical facts. Thank you.
We're going to move into discussion time now. If I can fix up the microphone, just broke. About 45 minutes of discussion. Now, we might stand up for this. Oh, that's so much more freeing. I love carrying the microphone here. We're going to probably stand up for this so we can see you guys in the back, and also for people that just walked in. We just had our opening and rebuttal remarks, so we're going to move into a period where you guys get to posit questions to both of our speakers. So what I'm thinking of doing is I'm going to go up to you, just raise a hand if you have a question, and please try and make it a question, not a statement or a diatribe or anything as I said previously, but something that you earnestly want to clarify about one of the points was made. So where are we going to stand? We're just going to stand here, and if anyone has a question, just raise your hand now, and I'll go over to you. You're the first one. Okay.
Hi there, this question is for James. I'm just wondering, if Jesus was resurrected, what kind of evidence would you expect if it happened?
Well, I'm using one microphone at the moment, so I'm just going to get very fit after tonight. Is that
Hello? So, microphone confusion. The question was, if Jesus was resurrected, what evidence would you expect to see? Well, the evidence that we do see of an empty tomb and appearance reports are consistent with the evidence we would expect to see. The question is, can we adjudicate on the basis of the evidence that we have between my account and Robert's account, basically, what happened? Maybe you could the question we could consider is, what evidence would prove my account wrong? And that would take sort of some thought about looking at details. But I think that one example of something that would prove it wrong, or at least substantially increase the doubt that it could be true, would be if we had reports, for example, from the Romans or the Sanhedrin, people directly from those who wrote accounts similarly early, that they had experienced these sorts of appearances as well. That would be, I don't think that would disprove it alone, but that would be some evidence against. Maybe if we had some further documentary evidence that would shed doubt, cast doubt on my Ribeiral hypothesis, that might also do it. So, I mean, that's a complicated question, but I think the key issue is how can we adjudicate between the two hypotheses and what evidence would do that?
Could I just respond or say something? So, James, and the question would be, how do you account then for the conversion of Paul? Because isn't that kind of the evidence that you want? To a hostile person who actually sees the risen Jesus and is converted?
Yeah, so the conversion of Paul is an interesting one. I don't think that I think the conversion of Paul is a distinct question from what we're debating tonight, which is the historical facts about the resurrection and appearances, or purported resurrection of Jesus. I know Robert disagrees with me about this, but I don't think that the statement or hypothesis, God raised Jesus from the dead, explains why Paul was converted. I think we would need to posit some additional reasons as to, well, why did God want to appear to Paul? Remember the quote that I read out. From our explanation, the fact should follow as a matter of course. I submit that it doesn't follow as a matter of course that if Jesus was raised from the dead, Paul would be converted. It doesn't explain that. You need to introduce additional assumptions about why God's doing this, what reasons he has. So I agree. My account, I don't explain the conversion of Paul. Why is Paul converted? What's going on there? I think he probably had a hallucination. There's other things going on there which I could get into. But I don't think that your account explains it either. I think it's a separate issue.
I would dispute that, because the very fact that Paul suggests his resurrection account in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, he adds his appearance of Jesus, the risen Jesus, to the appearances which occur to the other disciples. So I think it has to be part of the discussion, or part of the consideration set for understanding the resurrection and how Paul was converted, because he was opposed to the Christian message, and it's quite clear. You've got to ask him, well, what was converted? He was very satisfied, very happy as a Pharisee of Pharisees. That's what Philippians tells us. And so that we actually need to account for that, and also we need to account for why does Paul's account, why does Paul then stick it onto the other resurrection appearances, Peter, the 12, the 500, and then we need to account for why is Paul's account different to the other accounts that we have in the Gospels. Because if Paul's account, yes, was a hallucination, then that's kind of what we would expect all of the accounts to be like. Because if it was simply hallucinations, then all of the accounts in the Gospels would be reported like Paul. Saw a vision from heaven, I saw the risen Jesus. And so that's what all the accounts were like. But we see it's very clearly not. And that's what I outlined in my opening statement. That there was a difference between, in the same narrative, in Acts, where Paul describes, his conversion is described, the type of conversion is very different to Jesus eating food and seeing the disciples in other parts of the cast. I just think that's exactly the question that has been raised. In some respects, you've just outlined the thing that falsifies it. And I think the conversion of Paul is one of the key pieces of evidence that weakens your theory, unfortunately. Can we just maybe change the microphone? So this is
I think you should have this microphone, and I should have that one.
that's fine.
I mean, I can keep talking, but yeah.
Was that a remark that you wanted to make?
So this is working. Why did Paul append his name to the list of appearances? I think there's a very clear reason for this. Paul was an outsider. He didn't know Jesus. He didn't know the disciples. He lived in a different place. The appearance to him happened several years afterwards. Right from the get-go, we see, even in the extant documents in the New Testament, controversy about, is Paul a legit apostle? And what Paul is trying to do in 1 Corinthians, and really in many of his other letters as well, is establish his status as an apostle. So of course he's going to put a list of all of the appearances to Peter and all the others, and then add his name at the end. That's exactly what his interest is. And I don't think that's especially cynical. That's just, that's how things work. I think Paul was genuinely converted. I'm not disputing that, nor do I dispute that he persecuted the Christians before. I'm not completely sold that the account of his conversion that we have in Acts, which was written, by the way, after Paul died and not by Paul, exactly explains what was going on there. I think there's a lot more going on to it. I agree that Paul's conversion is very interesting historically, and it deserves explanation. But again, my prime response is simply to say that the resurrection of Jesus doesn't explain the conversion of Paul. Again, think about that criteria I identified. Does it follow from the resurrection of Jesus that Paul would be converted? I don't think it does. So Rhbs Model does not explain the conversion of Paul.
Right, we're going to go for another question from the audience.
Mine is more of a comment rather than a question, but to start with, the problem I'm having with your argument, James, is that the disciples were constantly dragged before the Sanhedrin, the Jewish leaders of the day, and they constantly proclaimed that Jesus rose from the dead. If Jesus was buried at another tomb, then the owner of that tomb that Jesus originally laid in was part of the Sanhedrin leadership. And they could have easily turned to him and said, well, where have you buried him? And we can go and get the body and show the disciple he has not resurrected from the dead. And so that's the first comment. The second one is hallucination. I'm having trouble with it. Is, for example, Jesus had 4 brothers, at least. James was one of them. They hated Jesus. This was quoted by John. That hallucination would have not been the reason for their conversion to become leaders of the church.
Right, okay, so there are 2 key issues here. One is, how can I account for the fact that the Jewish leadership didn't just pull out Jesus' body and say, hey, here it is, and nip the Christian heresy in the bud, so to speak. And the second issue was about how can I explain the conversion of, or the seeing of Jesus by James, who previously wasn't a believer. So the first issue, why didn't the Jewish leadership produce the body? There's actually quite a lot of it saying here. I'll try and summarise the key issues. Firstly, at least as recorded, I think it's in Acts, the disciples didn't begin to proclaim the resurrection until several weeks afterwards. Now, by that time, in the climate of Palestine, any remains that existed would not have been identifiable. They didn't have forensic techniques back then. So even if the Jewish leadership had wanted to produce the body and knew where the body was, it wouldn't have solved anything. They could have produced the body of the crucified victim. The disciples would have said, that isn't Jesus, and nothing would have happened. Furthermore, I don't think that there's any real reason to believe that the Jewish leadership was interested in engaging in these sorts of disputes with the disciples. All we have recorded about that early period is a few chapters in Acts, and all it says there is that when the disciples said that Jesus was resurrected, they were thrown in prison, or that the Jewish leadership persecuted them in various ways. Nowhere does it ever say that the Jewish leadership was the slightest bit interested in debating or disputing their claims or disproving them. I think that the Jewish leadership at first couldn't care less about the Christian heresy. As far as they were concerned, once Jesus was dead, that was it. They didn't care what happened. Only later on, when they realised that Christians were proclaiming that he's risen from the dead and they're still continuing to be a problem, did they start to take them more seriously. But by that time, Jesus' body would have been long decomposed. And furthermore, it's not clear that they would have kept tabs on it. I think that Jesus' body was likely buried in a mass grave somewhere. Well, they don't know where in the grave it's been buried. No one in the Sanhedrin would have cared less about it as long as the problem was gone at the time that Jesus was crucified. So the short answer is basically that by the time it became an issue, the Sanhedrin didn't have the ability to actually persuade anyone. And the final point I would say on that is, personally, I believe that even if Jesus' body recognisably had been dragged through the streets of Jerusalem, the disciples still wouldn't have been convinced. My evidence for that is the numerous cases where new religious movements have had those sorts of things happen, very clear disconfirmations, and they still continue on. There's one study that I looked up where they looked at 13 of these movements, and 12 of them had very clear disconfirmations and still continued afterwards. I cited the example of the Jehovah's Witnesses, and there are many others. So that's my answer to the first question about why didn't they produce the body. Second, the conversion of James, I'll say very briefly. It says in some passages in the Gospels that during Jesus' life, James, brother of Jesus, didn't believe. Then we have records later on about James, brother of Jesus, being one of the leaders in the early church. And there are records of, Paul mentions, for example, of appearance to James. I think the problem here is inferring that because at first James didn't believe, and then later there was an appearance to him, that therefore his belief must have been caused by that appearance. Well, that's a fallacy. That's the post hoc fallacy. You can't assume that just because James came to believe, James had an experience after he didn't believe, that therefore he came to believe because of that experience. He could have come to believe in Jesus and become a follower at any time between the time when the Gospels say he wasn't and the event when it says that it appeared to him. So I don't think there's any real good reason to believe that James was converted by an appearance by Jesus.
Thanks, James. I will respond to a couple of things. And again, the Apostle Paul, his testimony and his experience, I think undermines exactly what you said. Because Paul, in his own works, his own writings, which is separate from Acts, says that, and it goes on from 1 Corinthians 15, which says that I, Paul, he calls himself the least of the apostles because he persecuted the church. So there was a clear interest in understanding and persecuting the church. Now, was it just simply because they don't like debating, etc.? I mean, the Jews are known as people of the book. They regularly engaged, they kept libraries, they regularly engaged in debates and discussions and teaching, etc. I think you would have to provide evidence to suggest that the Jews were uninterested in debate, etc. Unfortunately, I don't think you've actually provided any, it's just a series of assertions, unfortunately. And then I suppose, again, so the experience of the Apostle Paul, I think, is crucial in recognising that they did take an active interest in this. And similarly, the Jews did take interest. I mean, we just have the very fact that we can have ossuaries to this day, like James Cameron's famous documentary claiming the body of Jesus because it had names on the tomb. People knew where tombs were. We can't just assume that because they buried it, they suddenly forgot where it was. This was a leader. These people were invested in this Messiah, this person who they had spent years with, and he had suddenly dashed their hopes. They would have kept track of at least knowing where it was. I think that the suggestion that the tomb was lost, the body was in a mass grave, unfortunately that contradicts what you said before, that the body was reburied somewhere. So was it reburied or did it go into a mass grave? Again, we've just got to make sure that we keep a consistent story, but also one that is consistent with practices of the ancient times, and that explains all the data. And so we can't just consider it a series of just so stories, unfortunately, to explain things that otherwise are best explained by the resurrection.
I'll move on to another question from the audience. I believe you're next.
Yep. Yeah, so I'm going to give James a break and ask Rob a question.
Sure, great.
It's kind of a question of clarification, because it seemed like there was something that didn't quite mesh together in your rebuttal to James. Unfortunately, I think part of this takes a sort of tacit assumption about how much you agree with N.T. Wright.
Right.
I feel like you probably agree reasonably with N.T. Wright.
That's what we're talking about, but yes. I do, yes.
Yeah, okay, so particularly the point at which...
Turn on again, I'll get my smart meter reset. It's the IT, it's IT.
There we go. Oh, yeah. It's resurrected.
So
that's not a resurrection, by the way.
Evidently not. Yeah, so particularly the point where N.T. Wright argues that it was the Jewish framework of the first Christian believers that predisposed them to viewing the appearances as literal resurrection.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So, okay. So on the one...
So just for the benefit of those who couldn't hear, so maybe just use this one while you ask the question.
So basically Tom Wright argues that the reason the first followers of Jesus who were Jewish believed that the appearances were of a physical, literal resurrection was because of their Jewish mindset and Jewish worldview. That's the basic point, yeah. Okay, so the thing I find difficult to reconcile there is then, as part of your rebuttal to James, you argued that if these appearances, which you both agree on, are explicable on the basis of hallucination, that if it was a hallucination, they would have been more predisposed to view these appearances as images of a future eschaton, but not literal themselves. Correct. It seems to me that considering the point, the issue, the point at issue is the factums of the appearances themselves. I see that as a contradiction, right? On the one hand, you're saying that this same fact of the resurrection appearances, if it was explicable by hallucination, which isn't part of the fact we're trying to explain, that's a separate explanatory hypothesis. That on one hand, for some reason, because if they were explained by hallucination, their Jewish worldview would presuppose them to see them not as resurrection, but as some sort of ghostly image of the eschaton. But then, if it's literal, then their Jewish perspective would presuppose them to see it as a literal resurrection. I don't see how the explanatory hypothesis applies to the same factum would predispose the same Jewish worldview to come to different conclusions.
I'm not exactly sure what you're talking about, and I think I agree with most of it, so I'll just talk. And I'll just say, hopefully that'll kind of explain. Just to clarify, Jews believed in resurrection. When they meant resurrection, it was only one thing. That was a physical, flesh and blood, body reanimation. So the biblical background for this is passages like Ezekiel chapter 37, Daniel chapter 12, etc., where that actually was a reanimation. It wasn't like the Greek suggestion of the body is a prison house of the soul. It wasn't. They couldn't imagine a disembodied sort of future eschaton, as you described, which is eschaton is simply a way of describing sort of the future or the end times. So the Jewish understanding of the end times was that there would be this great resurrection. Now, N.T. Wright, this is why if you read some of his Resurrection of the Son of God, he will explain this in more detail. But he goes through the Jewish understanding was that, well, what happens before that final judgment, that last judgment? What will happen to the souls or the bodies of those who die? And so what happens is that he shows, and this common Jewish understanding was that the souls would somehow continue in some sort of form. And so with the Rich of Endor, for example, in 1 Samuel chapter 28, where sort of Saul consults a medium, which is stupid, he should have done that, but consults a medium, and suddenly the Rich of Endor brings up Samuel, and he talks to him. So in some ways that sort of reflects that there was this sort of this intermediate state kind of thing. But the Jews would never have suggested that that would be resurrection. But they would have said that that is some sort of intermediate state, which there was a lot of debate at the time and a lot of disagreement about the different Jewish understandings of what that meant. Some would have interpreted it more along Greek lines, that sort of like you become the soul that sort of lives this disembodied existence. But The general suggestion was that there was this sort of life, but then at the end of time, there'd be this great resurrection, everyone would be raised from the dead. So what N.T. Wright, controversially, he says, which is kind of, I think I've understood what he meant by this now, when he says the Jews understood as if it wasn't life after death, but it was a life after death. And so we had this sort of after-death life, which was not embodied, but then there would be this final resurrection, which would be this life after death. So the point that comes, and this is why unfortunately the I'm not thinking rugby here. I'm thinking the Rhbs model fails to account for the discontinuity between what actually occurred in that they actually saw this resurrection, this embodied state now in Jesus, which was completely contrary to what they expected at the end of time. And so, if there was simply an hallucination, they could have imagined it, say, like the Witch of Endor, with this vision of Jesus, and what he would have said to them was, "Your souls are safe. Wait for the end times, for the great resurrection at the end, last days." That if that, I'm just trying to reconstruct. If I think James's suggestion was true, what a more plausible outcome would have been for a Jewish mindset, and I think that it would have been more along those lines, anticipating the great resurrection at the end, rather than actually saying, no, that resurrection is now actually beginning now. The first fruits, and James is entirely correct in saying that. The first fruits are actually beginning now. And so that's why I think that the model fails to account for that. Unless, of course, that Jesus really was raised in flesh and blood and they actually saw and touched him. Then I think that's where they actually then started to say, they actually then started to believe that their perceptions of the future had changed because of their experience now. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it doesn't.
No, it doesn't?
We'll chat about that.
James, maybe your point is more technical than that.
It's just the point that when you talk about hallucination,
yes,
the same referent of that term is the resurrection appearances itself, right? That's the resurrection appearances plus the sort of explanatory hypothesis. But in particular, like what you're calling hallucination is has the exact same reference as the appearance itself, as such, right?
Yeah.
But when you talk about as hallucination, you say, well, their Jewish mindset would more likely view it as a sort of vision of the soul, like the medium event.
Yes, that's right.
But when you talk about the exact same reference, when you talk about the fact of the appearance, you say that Jewish mentality would predispose them to view it as and understand it as literal resurrection.
No, they wouldn't. They wouldn't have understood it as resurrection. So that's exactly my point. That's exactly the weakness with the model.
So the implication of that is you don't think that their belief in the resurrection came. Well, you don't think that the resurrection appearances as such led them to a belief in the resurrection. That must have come from elsewhere.
No.
Okay, we can talk about after.
I'm not quite sure I understand, but I think that's exactly the problem with James's thesis, that why would the Jews, thinking there's resurrection at the end of time, would have happened now if they just saw a hallucination?
But the same argument holds for if they just saw a resurrection appearance.
James, do you want to make a comment on the model?
Yeah, so I think my understanding of this, and I don't know if that exactly agrees with yours, but I say that the Jews, the disciples of Jesus, came to believe that Jesus rose from the dead because they believed that they saw and touched him, and also that his tomb was empty. And Robert seems to say that they came to believe that Jesus had rose from the dead because they actually did see and touch him, and his tomb was empty. I see those as effectively equivalent, except for did they really see and touch him? But they both, in both cases, believe that they did, and I think that that's really all that matters here. And I really just feel the need to jump back and talk and respond briefly to Robert's point about the interest that the Jewish leadership had in persecuting the early Christian movement, because I think this is really important, which is why I want to jump back just for a moment. Robert pointed out that obviously Paul is a persecutor, so doesn't that show that they have interest in responding to the Christian movement? Yes, absolutely. The key thing is the time frame here. Remember, Paul's conversion happened about 3 years after the crucifixion. By that point, yes, the Jews were interested, at least to some degree, in responding to the Christians. Again, it's not clear that Paul was engaged in debating with them and trying to prove using logic. He was a persecutor. I appeal to people here. How many people here engage in debates to try to logically show to people they consider to be in strange, unusual religions like Scientology or whatever that their beliefs are false? I contend that most of us don't, because we don't consider that a good use of our time. This would have applied to the Jewish Sanhedrin. What I'm saying is, 3 years later, yes, they were doing that. At the time, and this would have had to have happened within a few weeks, maybe even days, depending on decomposition rates, of Jesus being killed, is that the Jewish leadership would have had to have taken an interest in this. And I contend that at that very early stage they did not, because they didn't have any reason to.
I go for yes, very eager. That's over here. I can't forget about. You answer?
Thank you very much. Thank you, gentlemen, for your presentation. It's been very thought-provoking indeed. My question is for you, James. If Jesus was reburied, as you've explained, in accordance with the expectations and the customs of the day, this would have been known by all concerned, including the disciples. Therefore, the fact that his first burial place was empty would have been an unsurprising non-event. The only occurrence of any interest would have been if his second burial place was found empty, which I assume you don't believe was the case. So if his body remained in its second place of rest, the disciples would have known it, and all their resurrection claims would be knowingly false and fraudulent. So the question is, how did a known fraudulent falsehood become the pivotal cornerstone of a faith which has survived for 20 centuries, often in the face of intense persecution, to become the largest religion in the world today?
Amen.
So to answer your question, I reject the assumption on which it is based, which is that Christianity was based on a known falsehood. I reject it on the basis that I don't believe that the disciples knew that Jesus' body was in its place of the secondary interment. Now, what's my reason for saying that? Well, first of all, by the hypothesis that I've advanced, Joseph of Arimathea, or his servants, removed Jesus' body on the Sabbath evening and placed it in the common criminal burial grounds. Why would the disciples, whom the Gospels record fled in terror basically, why would they have known about this? Joseph of Arimathea did not. Well, we don't really know anything about him, but I don't see any reason to suppose that he's keeping tabs. I mean, there's certainly not Facebook messaging that he's moving the body of Jesus, or even in any communication at all with the disciples. We don't even know if they knew that Joseph of Arimathea knew the disciples. So I just don't see any reason to suppose that the disciples would have known that Jesus' body had been removed or that he had been reburied. In fact, we even see some evidences. I think it might be in the Gospel of John, I forget which one, but one of the women says that the tomb is empty and she doesn't know where they have moved him. So, I mean, this sort of account seems to indicate that the women or the disciples or both could have not known where the body was moved. So I contend that your assertion that if the body had been removed, everyone would have known about it is false, or at least is based on no reason.
Oh, did you want to respond to that?
I'd love to respond to that, because unfortunately James has not actually presented any evidence for that, except that the tomb was empty. And so he's just, in many ways, this goes back to the idea about the presuppositions that we come back with and says, well, what's a likely explanation? Evidence that the tomb is empty is that the tomb is empty. And that's not actually...
the evidence that the body was moved was that the tomb was empty.
That's not actually evidence. That's not actually evidence to suggest the body's moved, is that the tomb is empty. It's like saying, well, the reason that...
Well, you've got the two guards. You've got the guards who are supposed to...
So we're just going to say that without any positive evidence, that there's no positive evidence to suggest that the body was moved. And as I outlined, it would have been contrary to all the understandings of the time to move the body on a Sabbath. A Jew was not going to defile himself, not going to bother. The burial practices of the time was that the council member was to be responsible for disposing of the body. We know that Joseph of Arimathea put the body into a tomb, and we have absolutely no reason to suggest that the tomb was empty, except that the tomb was empty, which you're suggesting is evidence that the body's moved. It's not actually evidence that the body's moved. We have to have something other reason, something positive, except that the body has actually been moved. There's no evidence of this. It defies understanding of the Passover, the significance of the Passover. The fact that the disciples were so deeply invested in their leader defies all the explanations that we have. It defies why this defies all of the evidence that we have. There's no evidence.
Allow me to explain.
I'll give that back to James, then we'll get to a question over here.
So let me just quickly dispense with, the disciples weren't around, they didn't have control over Jesus' body, so what they wanted was beside the point here. And no one is saying that the body was moved on the Sabbath. I'm saying it was moved after the Sabbath, as soon as it was allowed to have been moved. Now, the key point here, though, is what is the evidence that the body was moved? And I think that the key difference here is to see what the logic is. Okay, remember, what we're trying to do here is explain a set of facts. The relevant fact here is that the tomb was empty. We both agree with that, right? How do we explain that? Robert's explanation is Jesus was resurrected. What is his evidence for that? His positive evidence for that? He doesn't have any. He is hypothesizing that to explain the empty tomb, plus a bunch of other facts, but let's just focus on the empty tomb at the moment. He's hypothesizing that as an explanation, and that's fine. That's what we do in everyday discourse in science. We hypothesize things. Remember, I mentioned hypotheses require assumptions. His assumption, or one of his, is that God exists, God wanted to raise Jesus from the dead, and that would, if you take those assumptions, explain why the tomb was empty. I need an assumption too. My assumption was that the body was removed. I do not have positive evidence for that assumption. The question is, how plausible is that assumption that I need to make in order to explain the fact of the empty tomb? And I think I've argued that the assumption, given the facts that we know, is quite plausible. So I don't need direct positive evidence that the body was removed, just as Robert does not need direct positive evidence that the resurrection occurred. We are both trying to explain facts by positing explanations. The question is, how plausible are our explanations?
I'm sorry, I need a very quick follow-up to that.
I'll bring you the microphone, actually.
Yeah, sorry. Regardless of what the disciples knew or didn't know, and when they did or didn't know it, the second half of my question still remains: how was it that a fabricated falsehood, something that was known not to be true, something that is absolutely false and fraudulent, how did it become the centre point, the pivotal point of what is now the world's largest religion? How likely is that should have survived 20 centuries, as I said, in the face of intense persecution, to become the world's biggest religion based on a total lie?
Well, I think I answered that because I don't agree that it was based on a total lie. I believe that the disciples sincerely believed. And I want to also point out that... Please, I'm answering your question, please.
I mean, factually speaking, not what the disciples believe.
Please.
Factually speaking.
We'll just let the answer happen first, and then if you want to...
I think it's clear that things can happen which, factually speaking, are based on falsehood. An example is all of the other religions that exist in the world. So if you believe Christianity is the true religion, Islam can't also be the true religion, in which case the second largest religion in the world, which has existed, okay, not for 20 centuries, maybe for 15 centuries, is based on a lie or a false or whatever. And I'm not saying that. I think that, we're not talking about Islam tonight, but the point is, clearly we can have religions emerge which are based on things that are not true, because there are differing religions which make incompatible claims about the way the world is. So I think that whether Christianity is that or whether Islam is that, we both agree, or whether it's another religion entirely, that can happen. And I'm saying that may have happened in the case of Christianity.
I'm going to move on to another question. I don't know why I'm still using this. just in case it starts to work again. But
I'll hold it here because I pretend that I'm speaking. I can actually hear it, that's good. Well, thanks both for civilising the substantive debate. I enjoyed it immensely.
This question's to James, and you've rightly alerted us to the importance of taking modern scholarship seriously, whether it be disciplines of psychology, neuroscience, sociology or history. So in the light of that importance of taking seriously scholarship, to what degree has the Rhbs Model run the gauntlet of scholarly review through peer-reviewed literature in journals of biblical analysis, history, and so forth?
Okay, so the question was essentially, given the importance of consulting modern-day literature in biblical studies and psychology and elsewhere, how has the Rhbs Model fared in that respect? Now, I'm afraid to say that it has not fared well in that respect at all, because I made it up, and so it has not been subject to any of these sorts of predictions. Now, I am hoping that in venues such as tonight, we can sort of get people thinking about it and critically responding to it, because I agree that we do need people to review it and to point out problems and so on. I'm certainly not saying it's perfect or there are no problems with it. I mean, that would be absurd. I think it is a reasonable attempt at a plausible explanation for a naturalistic explanation of the historical facts. And that's why I'm coming here tonight, to try and give my perspective and get people thinking about it. So I think that, yes, is absolutely important.
Although, thank you, James, and I do appreciate your originality of thinking as well, which I do really appreciate, and your interesting approach to many things. Although, unfortunately, a number of the elements of the model have already been subject to sort of scholarly elements. So, for example, hallucinations hypothesis has been around for a long time. For example, David Strauss in the 19th century was one of the first ones to do that. And interestingly, the whole kind of hallucinations idea was actually, in many ways, defeated by its own liberal scholars. So there was a sort of a scholarship debate in the 19th century, which ended up sort of they all ended up fighting each other. They all came up with all these different alternative explanations for the resurrection, to explain the resurrection and the empty tomb and the appearances, etc. But they all ended up kind of fighting each other and ended up killing each other in some ways. So it was sort of the only
alternative left standing in many ways was actually the resurrection hypothesis. So there are elements which have been subject to critical appraisal, and unfortunately my understanding of that is that generally the people don't find the explanatory power of things like the hypothesis, the hallucination theory to be persuasive.
Actually, another point, can I just ask for our audience, do we know how many... Do we know how many scholars are either for or against the resurrection hypothesis and other hypotheses? Is that something that we can comment on?
I'd say it's somewhat irrelevant because truth is not a democracy.
Well, we had a question about the intellectual and academic rigor about the hypotheses. I thought we could add to that.
I think just to respond to that, I mean that's somewhat flatly flippant, but it's also an important response because as James has alluded to, we've talked about at times, and it's underlying our discussion at many points, is that our presuppositions will determine the way that we respond to the data in front of us. And so, for many people, this is why the resurrection is such a crucial thing and a worthwhile thing to debate and discuss, because for many people, this is actually the piece of evidence that will convince them that A, that God's even there, and that B, He wants to have a relationship with us and He dies for us and was raised again to life and victory. So in many ways, this is a crucial piece of evidence. And so for some people who either say that God is impossible or philosophically impossible or will deny that, then we'll actually do a number of gymnastics and contortions to get out of the implications that the evidence of the data, of the historical data will actually come to. So in some respects, it's an interesting question to ask, but I think it's also fraught with danger because it will reveal in many ways the presuppositions of the scholars who are dealing with this topic. And that's one of the criticisms that sort of more conservative scholarship has received. People say, oh, you're just trying to confirm your own beliefs. And I think, well, maybe it's like what happened to the disciples, which I contend what happened to the disciples was that they actually had an experience, or that they actually encountered the risen Jesus and transformed their lives.
And this is precisely why we chose this topic for tonight, because it has such far-reaching implications for both Christians and non-Christians alike. I'm going to go to this man over here. Actually, this is going to cut out in like 3 seconds. So how about you just try and project from where you are?
All the best. Go for it. If you're going to like it, we'll just cut you off.
Is this projection okay, just before we start?
Yes.
So I have a question for James, but just before that, in terms of the elements thing, it's always good to try something new. There were elements of gunpowder around for a long time, without mixing them in the right proportion. So my question is about particularly the element of plausibility when it comes to the hallucinations part of your model. So I'm presuming this plausibility is obviously based around the scholarly consensus right now, and one thing you mentioned was the 10 to 30% of people who experience auditory hallucinations. My question is, I understand that there's a lot of different modern categories that go into the category auditory hallucination clinically, from thinking you heard someone yell at your name in a crowd to a full-on, the voice spoke to me and it told me whatever. I'm just wondering how you've gone about dealing with that, and also what might the percentages look like. What might the percentages look like when you bring it down to seriously viable auditory hallucinations, and also what does the change in percentages, how do you treat that when you're thinking about plausibility beyond one and comparing it with another?
Yeah, so how do I consider the fact that there are many different categories or varieties of auditory and other hallucinations, and how might the percentages of people who are subject to those hallucinations vary if we considered sort of more specifically the type of hallucinations I'm talking about? Is that a fair representation of your question? Yeah. So hallucinations is a very large and complicated literature, and I didn't even do close to justice to it with my few flippant citations tonight. I'm just trying to paint a picture that I think generally, yes, scholars believe that hallucinations are a lot more common than people think, and they don't just happen to the mentally ill. Now, most of those auditory hallucinations that people experiencing, yes, most people don't experience the risen Jesus appearing to them, yes. So a lot of those hallucinations are not going to be of the same nature. I acknowledge this. So exactly how you go from the particular psychological studies that we have to the case of the resurrected appearance of Jesus, it's very difficult because you don't have randomized controlled trials of people who were exposed to an appearance of Jesus and those who aren't. I mean, there's a certain degree of trying to extrapolate and make best sense of the literature, and that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to look at, well, what do we know psychologically, given that, how plausible is it that there could have been these sorts of hallucinations? I think that given what we know psychologically, combined with given what we know about the sociological processes that can operate to make people believe, particularly in the right environments, that they're experiencing supernatural or spiritual events. And there's many more examples of that I didn't cite this evening because I didn't have time. But combined with the historical cases of people in other religious and paranormal sort of environments reporting to see marvelous things, basically. I think when you look at this together, I think it becomes basically plausible that these sorts of hallucinations will happen. I certainly can't prove that hallucinations happen, and that's not my aim. Again, my aim is not to disprove the resurrection. It's simply to argue that I think that a naturalistic explanation is plausible. And my argument is, on the basis of these number of types of evidence that I've very briefly cited, I think the hallucinations that I posit are plausible. But I certainly can't prove that they happen, no.
I mean, I just respond, and I mean, I hate to disagree, but I kind of do. That hallucinations, I agree, are certainly plausible. There's no question that there's literature to suggest that hallucinations are plausible. The question is that this is what we're debating tonight. Does it explain the multiple appearances to multiple different types of people at multiple times? And my argument, I mean, I know you talk about that it's added with group sort of reinforcement and etc. as well, but the very fact that we have to explain why they began in the first place and why someone would interpret that as a resurrection, and it's just, to me, it's implausible from the understanding of not only the emotional attachment, the emotional perspective of the disciples at the time. They weren't expecting a resurrection. That was one of the last things that they were expecting. One of the key elements in terms of hallucinations for it to actually work is that there needs to be an element of expectation, and they weren't expecting a resurrection. I know that you talked about the fact that the Gospels did mention that the resurrection was there, but your explanation of that the Gospels talked about, there was, Jesus spoke about his resurrection, and then there was just some sort of skeptical, what did you call it? It was a skeptical kind of literary device in the resurrection to sort of point that out. It reeks of conspiracy theory, that it actually sort of says, well, we can't, that they did this device in order to prove that they were actually expecting the resurrection, etc., etc. The whole thing just, unfortunately, I think, falls apart when you start trying to explain the different types of resurrection appearances at different times, and not only the verbal times, but the touching, etc., etc., eating fish. There's just the Jewish conception of the time, the Jewish understanding of anthropology of resurrection. This wouldn't have allowed them to get from hallucinations to the different types of resurrection appearances that we need to account for.
All right. Yes, over here. Yes, if you could try, Jake, that'd be great.
Hey, I'd like to answer some questions as well, if that's all right. really. Make it.
Thanks. Yeah, I've got a question for both of you. I feel like neither case is actually as strong as either of you think it is, and that the presuppositions are doing the work. So my question is sort of to test that, and that is, Rob, imagine if you were an agnostic. Maybe you're pretty confident that the universe was meaningless, that Jesus' teaching maybe seemed like mumbo jumbo. How far do you think the evidence that you described would get you? And to James, my question is, imagine that you were pretty confident there was a God, you thought Jesus' teaching was awesome, maybe you had some religious experience, like you felt like, you had sins that you wanted forgiven or something. Can you imagine being a Christian with integrity? And yet, Rob, can you imagine being unconvinced with integrity based on the evidence?
Do you mind if I go first? Thank you. Thanks for letting me go first as well. I appreciate that. In many ways, when you described my journey for many years, that I wrestled with skepticism, wrestled with atheism, wrestled with... in fact, that was one of the reasons I read The God Delusion about 10 years ago, was to say, well, I was going to Bible college at the time, I thought, if I'm going to be going to give up my good job, etc., that I've done before, if I'm going to do this, I want to make sure I'm doing it for the truth. And that really did rattle me. And I sort of, and in many ways, it's one of the reasons I engage with atheism, because it's not just an intellectual exercise, it's actually an existential journey that I'm sort of walking in many ways. But maybe I haven't maybe because I spent too much time on reburial and not enough time on the appearances. Also not enough time on 1 Corinthians 15, which I think to me is the crucial piece of evidence. That because it's formulated so early, because it has multiple appearances, it presupposes an empty term, but it also provides an explanation for that in a way that would be radically different from any Jews at the time. For me, that was the piece of evidence that actually said, I've got to account for this. I need to explain how does this resurrection so early, there's no time for legendary embellishment, or very little time for legendary embellishment. How do I account for that?
And to me, 1 Corinthians 15 is the crucial piece of evidence. Sorry, is that, maybe I'm not answering your question.
Just to clarify, my question was, imagine that you're an agnostic or an atheist or just generally skeptical and you aren't convinced by Jesus' teaching, for example. How far would that evidence get you? Do you think it would get you the whole way?
Well, I've just outlined my journey, and in many ways it's got me over the line.
Okay.
Because I stood there at the precipice thinking, am I just going to give this away? And then 1 Corinthians 15 was the crucial piece of evidence that gave me good reasons to believe, actually there's good reasons to believe the resurrection actually happened. It impacted people, that it was not late, not embellished, and it doesn't require the historical reliability of the Gospels at all. It's a creed embedded in part of 1 Corinthians. If you wanted some sort of gold nugget to talk about the resurrection, its early appearance, and it describes and it explains all this thing, then that's it, and that's what got me over the line. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks.
So I think that the Rhbs model that I've outlined can account for something, a document like 1 Corinthians, but I think that would just be rehashing what I've already said about the hallucinations and the expectation and the memory and cognitive biases and all that. But let's answer Leon's question. And that is, suppose I believed in God and I thought read Jesus' teachings and were sort of approving of them, and I had some sort of religious experience of myself. So I'm in that set of background, and the question is, what would I think then of the evidence, the historical facts, or my explanation?
Yeah. Do you think you would you could then sort of be a Christian with integrity, or would it get you nowhere, or get you the whole,
No. Okay. So I think my answer to that is a bit different, Roberts, because I said this at the beginning of the evening, and I want to make it very clear. I am not arguing that the resurrection didn't happen. I'm arguing that, absent particular theological presuppositions, the best explanation is a naturalistic one, similar to what I'm outlining. Now, if I believed in God, if I believed that Jesus was pretty special, and you can qualify exactly what I mean by that, if I had certain experiences which I believed were reliable and connecting me to the divine, painting that picture, then I have those theological presuppositions, and I think those are justified. Now, given those, the plausibilities are very different, and I think someone with those prior beliefs would quite rationally believe, or could quite rationally believe, that the resurrection was the best explanation. So I'm not saying that the resurrection can never be the best explanation. It's only, I'm just making clear, it's only absent particular theological assumptions, which I don't think we all share. So for people like me who don't share those, I don't think, and this is where I differ with Robert, I don't think that agnostic is, or ought to be convinced just by that evidence alone.
Yes, you. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, can I just clarify that? You added, if I believe in God, to that list. If I believed in God, could you maybe subtract that? And
So you didn't believe in God, but what's left on the list?
You thought Jesus' teachings were kind of special in some
Oh, right.
way. You had some sort of vague religious experience, but you couldn't quite attribute it to anything.
Yeah, so could just religious experiences plus thinking Jesus is special, when you bring that to interpreting the evidence, get you to a belief in God? I think for me that would be a tall order. I think I would need additional reasons to believe in God, and maybe you can get those from natural theology. I don't think I can make pronouncements about what for everywhere and everyone would be the rational response, but I think it would be a tall order for the extant historical facts to get you to belief in God without, if you don't start from that standpoint, or at least thinking it's pretty plausible.
We've probably got about 5 to 10 minutes left of questions before we'll go into our final remarks, so that's probably 2 minutes each. So we'll continue, you had a question first, and then we'll go to you.
Yeah, Robert, you answered the question about being an atheist.
Yep.
But you had the presupposition that the Bible was true and correct. Would that be
sort of.
because you believe the statement in the Bible is 1 Corinthians?
Yep.
Why not the Quran?
Well, I don't think the Quran ever makes the same sort of claims about a person.
No, I mean just the belief in a book.
I wasn't such a belief in a book. It's a belief, I suppose, in a document within a book. And the Bible, because the Bible is a multifaceted book. There's a number of different letters and documents, etc., that combine. So the Bible is not just like a Harry Potter novel that you kind of just start from chapter 1 and begin all the way through. It's a collection of books in many ways. The thing that convinced me, I suppose, about 1 Corinthians 15 was that it was something that predated even the Apostle Paul. It's the earliest piece of writing that we have in the New Testament. So, as an historian, someone who's looking at the historical understanding of which you need to explain, regardless of whether you're a Christian or not. You need to explain how these documents, this is what I outlined, my fourth point in what I was talking about, You need to explain how these documents emerged in history. And to me, 1 Corinthians 15 is the creed quoted there in verses 3 and following. Is the earliest part of the Bible that requires explanation. So, just as a historical piece of information, you just need to explain that. And to me, the best explanation was that what was written there is actually true.
Actually, on that point, Robert, if I can combine Leon, was it? Yeah, Leon's and what was your name? John. Both of their questions into one question. And this is a question I have, and I feel that people would.
So as a MC, you're going to ask your own question.
Well, perfect the job. But not to put you on the spot, but
sure, happy to be on here. Happy to be on the spot.
75% of the questions have gone to James so far. That's probably because of the demographic in the room. But just to combine these two questions together, you said that it was that passage in Corinthians that sort of got you over the line, right? Mm-hmm. And it was that as from the perspective of an historian, looking at that you went, this is satisfactory, and you know, applying your, as you said, your existential journey to trying to perform an exegesis on this passage. Mm-hmm. You know, it gives you a certain, you can be satisfied in that belief. Mm-hmm. Now, could I ask, combining those two questions, if that would have been as equally as satisfactory if you, and it's really hard to answer, if you had not been a Christian to begin with?
I would like to think we could.
Yep.
But as I said, presuppositions are hard.
Yeah.
They are so hard to overcome. And that's why one of the things when I was at theological college, I sort of actually, the test that I used to try to adopt, I mean, I don't know how you do it really in some ways, but as I said, okay, assume I'm wrong, what does the data say?
Yep. And
then just let the evidence speak for itself. What is the most natural explanation for the data, phenomena that we need to account for? And that's what I suppose I'm trying to do in many ways. That's why I try to ask the bigger questions, because if we let the facts speak, I mean, again, it's really, really hard. And there are people who, no matter how, as I said to the guy I said about the atheist, I hope there's no one here who said, you know, he asked me. I sort of asked him, so what would convince you that God's there? He says, a miracle. I said, can you believe miracles can happen? No. Okay, well, it's kind of close story. Your presuppositions will actually shape the way you view evidence. Now, that's very, very hard, and you don't want to accuse the people on the, you know, it's very hard to overcome that. But I think we can try, but we've got to acknowledge that we might just have a predilection not to. The question in my mind is, what convinced someone like the Apostle Paul? So the Apostle Paul, who used that and added his name to that, was completely the opposite. He had no indication. He was persecuting these guys. And so we've got to ask, well, what convinced him? Because something had to happen, something transformative. And then my suggestion, well, why not what actually the Bible records? Because it actually explains all the data quite satisfactorily. We don't have to resort to any other reburial hypotheses or hallucinations, etc. In some ways you could argue that it was somewhat of a hallucination, but it was actually the encounter with the risen Jesus that transformed his life.
Yeah. I think Robert just sums up pretty much why we have these debates, because we're aware that everyone comes with their own lens in which they view reality. We all have a sort of predispositions to things. We bring things to the table, and in some degree that's the best that we can do. If we take them, we acknowledge them, we try and discuss them. Now we have one more question over here. I'll take only I think one more question, and then we'll go into our final remarks. But yes,
I'm just wondering how you often stated that Jews believe that resurrection will happen at the end.
Yes.
Where do you get that from, one, but how do you reconcile that with Jesus' own teachings that he would be raised from the dead on the third day, and the other resurrection accounts in the Bible, like Elijah and Elisha?
Yeah, just a point of clarification. Elijah, Elisha, Lazarus, etc., they're not resurrections, they're resuscitations. Those people were raised to die again. So the key difference is, and this is the crucial difference, this is why this is such a radical understanding for first century Jews, is that the resurrection that Jesus speaks about is that death is finished. That this is what 1 Corinthians 15 goes on. If you read the whole chapter, it gets to the end. It says, why death have you lost your power? Death have you, but where is your power? Where is your sting? Because ultimately death has been overcome in resurrection. So that's the new world that Jesus brings and ushers in with this resurrection. And that's why suddenly the end times, in many ways that's exactly what James has outlined, is that the end times have come in the middle of history, and it inaugurates the beginning of the end in some ways through Jesus' resurrection. So that's what I'm trying to outline in terms of the expectations that they face. in John chapter 11, when Martha describes the resurrection, Jesus says, there's a conversation there about the resurrection, which is in many ways a discussion of what their expectations were and what Jesus comes to bring. Where she's talking about Lazarus, the guy who's died, and her brother, and she says, Jesus says he will rise again, and she says, yes, I know, at the end of time, at the last day. But Jesus then goes and says, unbelievable thing for a first century Jew, for any Jew at that point. He says, I am the resurrection and the life. And I mean, that in some respects, that is so utterly unexpected, that they almost wouldn't have believed it. They wouldn't have believed it in some ways, until maybe he actually was raised from the dead to confirm it.
Do you think that his, like Jesus' own teaching that he would be raised on the third day would be a reason for the disciples to believe he'd be raised on the third day?
Well, again, this is an interesting thing. This is where we can't, I mean, in some ways what best explains that, and this is what we've talked about, that Jesus did raise it. But the question is, well, why then do the narratives themselves paint the disciples as dimwits, not actually getting it? Like, so Jesus in their own narrative has said, look, Jesus is raised, I'm going to be dying, suffer at the hands. Again, the very fact that it was suffering Messiah was completely contrary to expectations of first century of Messianic Judaism. The Messiahs were supposed to conquer the enemies. They were supposed to rebuild the temple, and they were going to bring justice and peace in the American way. Well, maybe not the American way. maybe if they were maybe the Mormons, perhaps. I'm not sure. Sorry, I don't need to make anything fun. But then for the resurrection to then come and then for the Messiah to suffer and die, they're thinking, hang on, this is not what's going to occur. So there's several elements within that sort of little suggestion that Jesus makes there that was completely discontinued, completely contrary to any expectation of a suffering, not only a suffering Messiah, but then one who would raise from the dead. In many ways, and that's what Peter says in the narrative. He says, well, look, come on, Jesus, this is not what it's all about. That's recorded in the narrative. And the question is then, why do we then present the disciples in such a foolish way? If these were the leaders now, the apologists going out trying to convert the world and say, actually, look, you guys didn't quite get it. You're not very smart. You didn't quite get it. You've got to explain why do we have this inconsistency there. I mean, it could be conspiracy theory, or you could actually just explain that these disciples didn't quite understand until they actually encountered the risen Jesus.
So I just clarify that I don't think it was a conspiracy theory. What I discussed was a motive of prior skepticism, or avowal of prior skepticism. Now, I think this is something that we see people making these sorts of claims do. It's not considered to be disingenuous. It's just a matter of phrasing things in a way that is persuasive to your audience, and this is what we all do. Plus, I think there's also some of those cognitive biases operating such that we actually convince ourselves that we were more skeptical beforehand than we think. So I just emphasize I'm not advocating any conspiracy there. There's one point that I wanted to make, which is this notion of the discontinuities of Jewish belief about the Messiah and the resurrection and some of these other issues, and how the Jews weren't expecting Jesus to, what happened to be, what they said happened to Jesus were not consistent with these prior beliefs. I actually think that this is a piece of evidence against the hypothesis that Jesus raised from the dead, or more specifically the hypothesis that Jesus was the Jewish Messiah. Now, if we believe that, as Christians do, that entails a number of theological beliefs about what the Messiah is and all of the Old Testament prophecies and that context of understanding. Now, most Jews at the time and throughout history have not accepted Jesus as Messiah precisely because of these discontinuities. Jesus, it doesn't add up. He doesn't fit the criteria for the Messiah. Now, I don't think that disproves it because, well, they could have just misunderstood the criteria, but at the very least, I think you should consider the fact that Jews' interpretation of their own holy books say that saying that Jesus was the Messiah doesn't add up because he doesn't fit the criteria. And so I think that counts as at least some evidence against the hypothesis that he really was the Messiah.
That was yes, that was 55 minutes of discussion. Well done, everyone. I hope that didn't bore anyone too much. I thought it was. Well, actually, I'm thankful that I followed everything. It's such a big topic, and I'd like to join with you guys in thanking both of our speakers for such an incredible night of discussion. It's not quite over yet. We're just going to have, well actually, I think I might, if you've both got your final remarks now, I can just pass it to you to make just a 2-minute response to everything, just to wrap it up, and then I'll wrap up the night. So starting with...
Well, What can I just say? Thank you very much for staying, except those people who just left. Thank you very much. This is a crucially important topic. As James has alluded to and said, this is probably the most important question that we could ever answer. And as Peter Hitchens said, this is the most dangerous idea that we could ever encounter. Because if it's true, then it changes us. If it's false, then our world becomes a meaningless chaos. And in many ways, it doesn't really matter. We should just maybe eat, drink, and be merry. It's exactly what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, if the resurrection didn't actually happen. But the resurrection did happen, and I commend you to continue the conversation, to continue thinking, and trying to work out what is the best explanation for the historical data you have. That the tomb was empty, that there were multiple resurrection appearances, that the changed lives of the disciples, and also the emergence of these documents with a fundamentally different understanding of messiahship and of resurrection. We need to account for all of these. And I contend, and I argue, that actually Jesus' resurrection is the simplest, the cleanest, and the most powerful explanation for the historical facts surrounding his death and resurrection. And so I would continue to implore you to continue discussing and thinking more, because this is a very dangerous idea. And if you believe it, then you can become a fool, just like me.
Well, I don't think Robert is a fool, and that's not what I've been arguing this evening. Because, again, to emphasise, I'm not arguing that Jesus didn't rise from the dead. I'm arguing that the best explanation for the set of historical facts surrounding his death and purported resurrection is a naturalistic one. He may still have risen from the dead without it being the best explanation for the facts. Now, why do I think this? I've tried to outline what I think is a plausible explanation. I call it the Rhbs Model. I don't think it's exactly right in all detail, and certainly it needs improvements, and there's probably some things I've gotten wrong, almost certainly. But I think that in core outlines, it provides an explanation with sufficient explanatory scope and power and plausibility in the light of the background evidence that we have to explain the historical facts. And I just want to leave people thinking about exactly what it means to explain something. Again, I think in order for an explanation to account for facts, those facts have to follow from the explanation as a matter of course, with reasonable probability. I think all of the key facts to be explained about the empty tomb, the appearances, sincere belief in the resurrection, and then writing that down and so on, can be accounted for by my model. By contrast, saying that God raised Jesus from the dead, I don't think accounts for the facts. You need additional beliefs about even if Jesus was raised from the dead, why would he want to appear to particular people at particular times? It doesn't follow from God raised Jesus from the dead that Paul would be converted. I contend it does not. Many of the facts that I think Robert has contended are explained by God raised Jesus from the dead are in fact not explained by it. They're explained by additional theological beliefs or assumptions about what God would want to do or how God would act in particular places and times. Now those might be true. I'm not saying all of those beliefs are false. What I'm saying is we don't have any independent reasons, like theologically independent reasons to believe those are true. So absent those particular theological beliefs that we would need, I think that purely on the basis of established facts, the best explanation for the historical facts is the naturalistic explanation that I've outlined. Thank you all very much for coming this evening.
This has been a crazy night. And if we've done our job properly, I hope that each of you are going to leave with what we usually say is a stone in your shoe. So basically something that niggles, something that you might have heard before, something that you might have heard being phrased differently by either Rob or James tonight. If you came very sure of your own beliefs and you leave very sure, that's completely fine. There's nothing about this that's designed to convert or designed to try and twist your ear in any certain direction. All we're trying to do with these events is to present different points of view. And so if this has encouraged you, I would encourage you then to write down and say that in your response forms, which each of you should have from the handouts that we gave. If there's any improvements that you think that can be made for the format for events that we might run later on in the year, please write that down as well, because we do read the feedback and we think it's very important that we're constantly improving the format so you guys can have an experience that you can feel like you leave the doors, A, in an edifying way, and B, in a way that makes you hungry for more, that makes you want to go and pick up a book on either side. So if any of those things have happened for you tonight, I encourage you to write that down and encourage these speakers. And join me once again in thanking both of our speakers because they've done an incredible job tonight.